Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Please be seated. I say, just every time I hear you guys sing, I hear such beauty come out of a few voices. It really does my heart good. Thank you, guys. Our epistle and collect today, they remind us that our citizenship in heaven starts right here in this particular life that we're living in. And therefore, St. Paul tells us that our conversation then is in heaven. And then our gospel then reminds us that this being the case, we owe it to God to give our lives over to Him while we still live and move and work in this realm that we call earth. Jesus today, he's approached by the Pharisees and Herodians, and they put this question to him: is it lawful to pay the tribute tax to Caesar? Of course, they were trying to trap Jesus, as they so often try to do. If Jesus answered one way, then they could turn him over to King Herod for prosecution, and then the other way, then they could say that Jesus wasn't being loyal to God. But Jesus is always several steps ahead of his enemies, and he gives them this answer. He says, well, first he asks, whose face is on this? Whose inscription is on this? And of course, their answer is Caesar. So he says to them, well, then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give back to God what is God's. Now, in a real way, we do owe something back to Caesar, to legitimate and lawful authority that God has invested among men so that we can govern ourselves. We owe an obligation then to obey that government. We owe an obligation then to pay our taxes for the services that have been rendered to us. And we owe an obligation then to meet the reasonable demands of government. But the operative word is reasonable. So then for us, what we owe Caesar is really rather limited. And that if there's anything that Caesar demands or requires of us or asks of us that is outside of the scope of God's will for our lives, then we cannot give Caesar that part of ourselves. And then the other side of that whole equation is this, is that even what we give to Caesar ultimately comes from God. So when it comes to God, we owe him everything. Back during the time of the Cold War, there was a famous Italian priest by the name of Father Luigi Giussani. And he was bitterly opposed to the communists who were at that time trying to take over Europe. And he used to love to point out their hypocrisy by telling this humorous story. He said there are two communists who were talking to each other. One asked the other, do you love the party? And the other's response was, yes, I love the party. I would give my life to the party. If you had $2 million, would you give your money to the party? If I got $2 million, I'd give everything of it to the party. And if you had a house in the Riviera, would you give it to the party? He said, absolutely. I would give it everything. The party to me is everything. It's my life. It's my very being. He said, well, what about that motorcycle that you actually own? The response was, no, stop right there. The motorcycle is mine. And he used to tell that to try to draw out another point, that as the communists, their motto is that they're bound to give up everything to the party is their God. For us Christians, our obligation is to give every aspect of our lives over to God. But like the communists in the story here, often we find ourselves clinging to certain little things, little aspects of our lives that we're not willing to give over to the Lord. I think when we do these kind of things, whether we're afraid to expose our sinful side to God, we forget that God sees and knows everything we do. He's just waiting for us to give it to him. And whether it is something perhaps that we truly value, that we think if we give it to him, that we'll never see it again, or perhaps somehow its worth will somehow be diminished. We forget that God takes everything that we have. He gives it to us, he blesses it, and he gives it back to us. It's a circular kind of thing. And we forget that. I think we really do ourselves a disservice when we do not hand everything over to God, because we're not receiving his blessings on those things, those aspects of our lives. So then we have to ask ourselves, what do we really give to God? Are we giving him everything? Are there parts of our lives then that we are withholding? Are we giving him our marriages? How about our children? And then our money. You know, that's always a big sticky thing for all of us. You know, we're always afraid that money is, if you depart too much of it, we're not going to have enough for food next week. We're not going to have enough perhaps for that meal we want to eat out. But God is telling us, whatever you give to me, I will take it, multiply it, and give it back to you. But you have to give it back to me. And then, are we giving God our minds, our hearts, and souls? We give him our conscience. We hand over the sins that we have committed. And say, Lord, I detest these. Please forgive me. So that he can then redeem them and perhaps bring some good out of them. And the point is that I think we've lived in a time, and I don't know if it's been a temptation of every Christian through every generation, but I think we live in a time now where we tend to compartmentalize our lives. We'll say, yes, I'll pay my taxes to Caesar, because if not, I'm going to get thrown in jail. I'll give God my 1 hour at church. I'll give God my whatever I tithe. But when I get out of here, everything else belongs to me. We can't do that. We can't do that. Perhaps one of the most common yet least acknowledged sins that any of us can commit is a sin then against the first commandment. Remember that? I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other false gods. And while we, being modern people, we may not worship the Roman gods or the Egyptian gods or even the golden bull that the Israelites had worshipped when they had wandered from God. But we all have this potential to stray. We have this potential to fall into the worship of something or someone else other than God. When I first read this, I thought, really was hitting me here because I see the truth in it, because I've seen the truth in myself. And if we're not inclined to believe this, then we have to stop and ask ourselves, when we're by ourselves, where do our thoughts go? Do they immediately go to God, or do they go to something else? If they don't immediately go to God, it might be a warning sign to us that perhaps we're holding on to that thing particularly strongly, and we're not giving it to God and we're turning it into a false god of sorts. So the question for us then really comes down to what truly matters to us. What truly matters? The things here in this world, the money we cling to, the parties we go to, even things such as, I know that we're a small church and we obsess sometimes over numbers, having more numbers. I know sometimes I do. But again, I was reminded this week that that can become a false god. That our first and primary calling is to be faithful Christians and faithful to the gospel and give witness to the gospel and to love. Not just one another, but out there. That's not easy to do. I know that we are struggling, and I know that we sometimes have very limited abilities, but there are things we can do. Perhaps, I had Scott Pager in here last week, perhaps that's not our, what we can get involved in, or maybe individually we can. Perhaps we can set up a youth group. But there are other things we can do. There's such things, anybody ever heard of Operation Christmas Child? Where you put together a shoebox with a few little gifts. You write a note to a child that's in another country that needs to hear the gospel. You include a picture and perhaps a small Bible. And I believe this is spearheaded by the part of the Billy Graham mission effort. And it might be too late for us to get involved in that this year because they kind of have their collection now. But maybe next year. It would be a wonderful project for us to do. A way for our hearts to reach out across the world to some child that needs to hear the gospel. I hear testimonies on the John Boy and Billy show. I do watch the John Boy and Billy show, or listen to the John Boy and Billy show every day. But they have people on and they give testimonies. And these people, they do give their lives to Christ. And they end up becoming part of that whole movement. So there are ways for us to let go of the things that we kind of cling to and are afraid to let go. And I know I'm guilty of it too. But God says, let it go. And I will bless it. I will multiply it. And I will give it back to you. So then the only question is, have we really committed ourselves completely, 100%, to being true disciples of Jesus Christ? There's a story of a young boy who sat in church and watched as the offering plate was being passed. And then wanting to give something, he reached inside his pockets, but found that he had nothing to offer. So as the plate made its way down the pew row, it finally got to him. And what he did dismayed everybody. He put the plate on the ground and stepped inside of it. And his mother asked him, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, if I can't give Jesus my money, I can give him my heart. I can give him myself." And that's what it really comes down to. What are the things that we're clinging to in this life that we're not giving to God? Because God deserves everything from us. And then to be able to give ourselves to God then means that we have to step outside of our comfort zone. That's a hard thing. I covet my Mondays off. But I made myself go out and do communion calls this past Monday because it needed to be done. And once I got over the grumbling, I was happy. I came back, I was happy. God bless me. Now, I can't reach everybody because some people don't answer their phones. But the people I could reach, I went and got to. But the point is, God really does bless what we give Him. But we have to be able to step out of our comfort zones and be able to take that risk. And then we need to be able to then get to a point in our lives where we can stand up and testify to the truth of the gospel. We need to be able to stand up and then become strong witnesses and advocates for the sacredness of life and the dignity of the human person. In other words, what we need to do then is to start showing others the truth of what it looks like and what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God. And then what it really boils down to us as disciples is that discipleship then should be a reflection of Jesus Christ dwelling within us. That means then discipleship then should have an actual bearing on the way that we speak and we act in the world around us. It doesn't mean we conform to Caesar or the world standards, but the Christ standards. And the epistle makes it abundantly clear that our lifestyles must be radically different from those of the worldly around us. As St. Paul says, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, whose glory is in their shame, those who mind earthly things. But we can't do that. We can't give ourselves to Christ. And really, all that we do here is really nothing at all. As long as we hold back from God, we'll never be able to effectively share with others. we don't live joyful and faithfully in our own lives. Amen. In the words of our Lord Jesus, how he says,